I hope that you are well and that you had an amazing day. All right, so for today's grade 1 English class, we will be doing adjectives, right? And before we start with adjectives, we're going to the aplusstudents.ca. Once you go into aplusstudents.ca, you're going to log in with your username as well as your password. We're going to select the subject of language arts because we'll be doing English today, and then grade 1. All right, so once we've selected the subject of language arts, we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of adjectives. All right, so we are doing the chapter of adjectives, and our focus or our lessons for today will be on comparing pictures using adjectives. Use number words. Does the adjective tell us what kind or how many? You will use since words and identify adjectives. So we will end off with identifying adjectives. All right, so we are going to go straight into our lesson on adjectives, and we're going to start with compare pictures using adjectives. All right, so an adjective is a word that tells us about a person, right? So it basically tells us about the noun, and a noun, it tells us about a person. A noun names a person, a place, an animal, or a thing, right? So all of these things, if we were to put it in a bracket, right? Person, animal, place, or thing, these are nouns, right? Because a noun, it names a person, it names an animal, it names a place, or it names a thing. So an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun, right? And nouns, they name a person, a place, an animal, or a thing, right? All right, so some of the adjectives, right, will tell us what kind, right? So it can either be what kind in size, in color, it's more an explanation of something, right? And you also get adjectives that will tell us how many, right? It is where you would either give a number like 5 or 3 apples, 1 bowl, you understand? But in this case, some adjectives, they tell us what kind, right? So in this picture, if we look at the first picture, Tom, or the example, Tom sees a big truck, right? So big, it tells us what kind of truck, right? A big truck. Because instead of Tom saying that Tom sees a truck, we can say Tom sees a big truck, right? So it can be big truck, small truck, blue truck, red truck, right? But in this case, the adjective is big and it tells us what kind of truck. We have a red ball, right? We have a red ball. So red is the adjective that tells us what kind of ball, right? So in this case, it tells us the color, right? So red is a specific color. So they can either say a red ball or the small ball, right? Or a tennis ball, cricket ball, right? But in this case, we have a red ball, right? Which tells us what kind, specifically in color, right? All right, so now if we look at this first like sentence or question, they're basically asking us to find the wet puppy, right? So if we were to find the wet puppy, then if we look at the picture, right, that we see in front of us, we basically see a wet puppy, right? And what tells us that the puppy is wet? It's because, firstly, how the puppy looks, but also the water or the droplets that is dropping from the puppy. And also, it shows that the puppy is in a puddle, right? So, little droplets or water is dropping from the puppy's fur. So here it says the adjective wet, right? So wet, it tells us what kind of puppy to find, right? So they specifically ask us to find a wet puppy, right? If they maybe said find the brown puppy, then we were specifically going to look at the color of the puppy. But since they said we need to find the wet puppy, right? Now we look at things that shows us what, or things that indicate that the puppy is wet, right? Which is the droplets, the water, even the way his fur looks, right? So the poor puppy is soaking wet. So yeah, they said find the wet puppy, and we basically found it, right? This is the wet puppy. What kind of puppy? The wet puppy. So wet is the adjective that tells us about the animal, right? It tells us about the puppy, and it tells us what kind of puppy to find, or what kind of puppy we are specifically looking at. All right, if we look at the picture in front of us, right, about the baby, right? This is a happy baby, right? And we can also see by the baby's smile, the baby's being jolly, playing with his or her toy, right? So basically, it says that this is a happy puppy. So happy is the adjective that describes or tells us about the baby, right? So basically, the question is what kind of baby, right? And then we can say this is a happy baby. If the baby was being sad, we could have changed this word from happy to being sad. If the baby was um, crying, we could have said this is the crying baby, right? But in this case, we are describing the baby as being happy, right? So, what kind of baby? This is a happy baby. So when it comes to adjectives, right, we either need to ask ourselves what kind or how many, right? And in this lesson, we are specifically focusing on what kind, right? And what kind can either be where you are happy, you are sad, it can explain a different color, it can maybe talk about size, right? Those type of things. All right, so they say we need to find the deep water, right? We need to find the deep water. And if we look at the picture over here, right, this is the deep water, right? And what indicates or shows us or tells us that this is the deep water, it is the let's say is this the diver? Yeah, the diver being deep underwater, right? In the ocean specifically, right? So they're also showing the, let's say, basically the height, or basically how deep or how low he is, right? And so this is the deep water, right? If it wasn't deep, they probably wouldn't have shown us how deep he has gone, right? Then we would have probably been somewhere here, or showed us where he could probably stand, or they probably would have just showed a pool instead of the ocean. So this is the deep water, right? So what kind of water? The deep water, right? So basically if we look at these pictures, right, These pictures either tells us what kind, right? It tells us what kind of person, what kind of animal, what kind of place, or it can tell us what kind of thing, right? And just to recap again, an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun, right? It describes a noun, and a noun names a person, an animal, a place, or a thing. So, yeah, based on this definition, an adjective is a word that tells about a person, an animal, a place, or thing. And based on the lesson so far, these are the adjectives that tells us what kind, and it can be in size, it can be in color, it can even be in mood or emotions, right? But they are telling us what kind that we need to look at. Or basically, it's describing or telling us about either a person, a place, an animal, or a thing. All right, so before we go on to our test, right? Let us quickly go to this picture. So here they say an adjective, right? So adjectives are describing words, right? And we see that it tells us about a person, place, an animal, or thing. So they describe the person, the animal, the place, or the thing, right? So adjectives are describing words. They tell you more about a noun, right? And we said that the noun, it names a person, a place, an animal, or a thing. For example, the small purple ball, right? So here they are basically describing this purple ball. So the small purple ball bounced across the floor. So instead of just saying that the ball bounced against the floor, they are telling us that the small purple ball, which means that this ball is being described not just in by let's say for example in size, but it's also being described in color, right? Which means that we will know what specific ball to look out for. Firstly, it is the small ball, or you can either say, or you can maybe just look at the color, which is the purple ball. So the small purple ball bounced across the floor. So this is describing the ball, small and purple. What kind of ball? The ball is small and purple. The soft blue blanket was folded on the bed. So instead of just saying that the blanket was folded on the bed, we are describing the blanket, right, as the soft blue blanket, right? So we are saying that this blanket is soft, but also it is blue in color, right? So that basically describes the noun, right? So it describes whatever that we are actually talking about. All right, if you look at this one also here, the paper was crinkled and dirty, right? So here they're also telling us about the paper, right? Not only was the paper crinkled, but the paper was also dirty, right? And that is describing the type of paper. All right. Okay, so if we look at this picture, so here we see that adjectives, right? It tells us about nouns, right? And like for example, with this example that we made about the small purple ball bounce across the floor. Remember we described the ball as being small, which is in size, and purple, right, which is in color. So here they are saying that adjectives, it tells us about the noun, right? And we said nouns, it names people, places, animals, or things, right? And adjectives, right? When it describes the noun, right? It's describing words. Usually it can be described in size. So we can describe the nouns either in size, we can describe the noun in color, right? By either describing or saying what specific color it is, the red apple, the green apple, the yellow banana, for example. We can even describe something in taste, right? The juicy mango, the sour lemon, the sweet grapes, for example. We can also describe something in numbers, right? By telling how many. So we can either say one apple, two boys, three giraffes, for example. Another way in which we can describe a noun, right, is how something feels, right? So we can either describe it as in it is cold or the hot. So the hot stove, the cold drink or something, the sharp pencil, right? So another way is how something looks, right? So we can say the bright star, pretty flower, right? So pretty, bright. Shapes can be round, the triangular something, this, the whatever, right? The circular ball or the round ball, right? So this is how we can describe nouns, right? Loud, how loud. You can either say something is loud or something is soft. How something smells. The stinky socks or the smelly socks, the fresh flowers, or how something or someone behaves. Being nice, being honest, being slow, being fast, right? So these are all adjectives that tells us about the nouns, right? And we said nouns, it names people, places, animals, or things, right? All right, so now we're going back to our tutorial on compare pictures using adjectives. So we're going to the test. All right, so we need to compare pictures using adjectives, right? We need to find the red book. So the red book, we need to find the red book, right? Either option one or option two. We need to find the red book. And here they're describing the book in color, right? The red book. So we need to find the red book. All right, so if we look at the two books that we see in front of us, right? We are specifically going to choose the red book, right? Which is option two, right? Option two is red in color, whereas the first option shows a blue book. Find the short bookcase, right? So find the short bookcase. Is it option one or option two? We need to find the short bookcase. All right, so if we look at the two pictures that we have in front of us, right? Here they are describing the bookcase in size, right? And they specifically want us to find the short bookcase, right? Which is option one, right? It is not a tall, big, long bookcase. This is a small or short bookcase. Find the flat land. So find the flat land. And how do we know if it's a flat land, right? We will know it's a flat land when we do not see a lot of mountains, right, or hills. So if we look at both pictures, we need to specifically find the flat land. Is it option one or option two? The flat land. All right. Let us choose one, right? So the flat land, there's no hills, there's no mountains, and that is option 2. All right. And then here they're asking us to find the warm room, right? So if we were to find the warm room, option 1 or option 2, is the warm room where someone is sitting in front of the fireplace, or where the windows are open and the wind is blowing through the, basically coming in from outside the window or from outside. So find the warm room. All right, so if we were to find the warm room, then we would specifically look at option 1, right? So what indicates that this room is warm? The fireplace, um, or let's say the fire that is also burning at the fireplace. And if we look at the picture 2, the way the lady's face is, or the way she's holding her arms, it shows that she is shivering, right? Because she's getting cold. So we will choose option 1. So well done if you have that. All right, so that is comparing pictures using adjectives, right? We're going on to the next one that says use number words. Number words. So our first lesson, right, we had to describe the adjectives by telling or saying what kind, right? And we said what kind can be in size, can be in shape, can be in color, right? So that showed us what kind. But now we need to use number words, right? Which means that these adjectives will basically tell us how many, right? Number words, numbers will tell us how many. So how many airplanes are there, right? Which means that we need to count how many there is, right? Which means that the number of either airplanes, the number of people, places, things, or animals will be our adjective, right? Because they will tell us how many there are. So if we look at these two, right? So how many airplanes are there, right? So if we count the airplanes, there's 1 and 2, right? So there's 2 airplanes. So we are going to write our words here, 2. Oopsie. So we're going to say 2 airplanes, right? So there are 2 airplanes, or you can just put the number 2, right? So these are telling us how many. So yeah, they're even saying that an adjective is a word that tells us about a person, it tells us about an animal, it tells us about a place, or it's telling us about a thing, right? And some adjectives, they tell us how many, right? And remember in our previous lesson, we said that the adjectives, they tell us what kind. And in this lesson, adjectives, they tell us how many, right? Some adjectives, they tell us how many. For example, Kim sees 2 trees. So how many trees does Kim see? 2, right? There's 1 and there's 2 trees, right? Which means that 2 is our adjective that tells us how many, right? I have 3 dogs. So how many dogs do you have? 3 dogs. So 3 is the adjective that tells us how many. So there's 1, 2, 3 dogs, right? Which tells us how many, which means that our adjective over here is 3, right? So 3 tells us how many dogs there are. All right, so how many ponies are there? We need to say how many ponies are there, right? All right, so if we look at the number of ponies that there are, there's only 1, right? So we can say there are, or there is one pony, right? So only one pony. And this is an adjective. One is the adjective that tells us how many. All right, how many cakes are there? So how many cakes are there? Right? If we count the number of cakes, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cakes, right? So there are 8 cakes. So you can either put the number 8, right, to show that there are 8 cakes, or the number name, which is 8, right? So there are 8 cakes, right? So which means that our adjective is it, and it tells us how many cakes there are. So wonderful. So this is the adjectives, right, that tells us how many, right? And we said how many tells us specifically the numbers, right? It is using number words to describe how many either people, places, animals, or things there are or is. All right, we're going to our test. How many airplanes are there, right? There's one, two, right? So we need to look at the number of airplanes. How many are there? There are two or one. We need to choose the best option in number that tells us how many airplanes there are. All right, so if we look at the number of airplanes, we said there's one, two, right? So there are two airplanes, right? So two airplanes. So if you have two, then well done. How many dishes are there? The options that we have is 5, and the other option we have is 10. So are there 5 dishes or 10 dishes? All right, let's count. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So how many dishes are there? There are 5 dishes, right? So 5 describes how many, or tells us how many dishes there are. How many bags are there? 8 bags or 3 bags? 8 bags or 3 bags? Let's count. There's 1, 2, 3, right? So there are only 3 bags. So we're going to choose option 2, right? And if you have chosen 3, then well done. How many cakes are there? We need to count the number of cakes there are, and we need to choose the best possible answer. Is there 2 cakes or are there 8 cakes? Let's count. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cakes, right? So we don't have only 2 cakes, but we have 8 cakes, right? So if you have 8, then well done. All right, we're going back to the next lesson that says, does the adjective tell you what kind or how many? Remember in our first lesson, right, where we compared the pictures using adjectives, they were telling us what kind, right? And the previous lesson that we just did, that we just finished, they told us how many. So now, does the adjective tell us what kind or how many, right? And this is once again just an explanation plus its examples telling us what an adjective is, and some that tells us what kind or how many. Like an adjective is a word that tells us about a person, a place, an animal, or a thing, right? Some adjective tells us what kind, and some adjective tells us how many. So how many are the number or the amount of either people, animals, places, or things there are. What kind can either be in size, color, shape, and so on. Even scent, how it smells, right? All right, so now if we look at our question that we have over here, it says you need to look at the adjective in bold, right? So the adjective in bold is 5. Does it tell us what kind or how many? So it says 5 crabs, 5 crabs. So does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? All right, so the word 5, right? 5 tells us how many crabs there are, right? So it tells us how many. So there are 5 crabs, right? So 5 is the adjective that tells us how many crabs there are. So look at the adjective in bold, which is loud. Loud. Does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? Loud. Loud birds. All right, so loud birds, right? It tells us what kind of birds. So the loud birds. So what kind of birds? The loud birds. Look at the adjective in bold. Does it tell us what kind or how many? And old coat. And old coat. Does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? All right, so old, right? Old that describes the coat. It tells us what kind of coat. It is an old coat. All right, so these are words that tell us, or adjectives that tells us either what kind or they tell us how many, right? Let's go to our test. To test if we will be able to identify if it tells us what kind or if it tells us how many. So you need to specifically look at the word in bold and we need to say if it tells us what kind or how many. A long road. So the word long does it tell us what kind of road or how many roads? Long. All right, so the word long, right? The long road tells us what kind of road. It is a long road. Some painters. So the word some painters, right? Does it tell us what kind of painters or how many painters? So kind, some painters. Does it tell us what kind of painters or does it tell us how many painters? Some. All right, let's choose one. Let's say some kind of painters is how many, right? So with how many painters, it doesn't necessarily have to be the number, right? If you say some, a few, even if you say many, right, or a lot, that also tells us how many, right? So that tells us how many. A new bike. So the word new, does it tell us what kind of bike or does it tell us how many bike? New bike. All right, so new bike, it tells us what kind of bike, right? He has a new bike. All right, so that was our lesson on does the adjective tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? And remember, we said that with how many, it doesn't necessarily just have to be a number. It doesn't have to be a number 1 to 10, for example. It can be some, can be few, it can be many, it can be a lot, right? Because it describes the noun by telling us how many. A few is how many. A lot is how many, right? Some is how many. All right, so now we need to use sense words, right? That's where we're using our senses, right? So an adjective is a word that tells about a person, an animal, a place, or a thing, right? And some adjectives, they tell us how a noun look, they tell us how a noun sounds, they tell us how a noun tastes, they tell us how a noun smells or how a noun feels, right? So some adjectives, they tell us how a noun looks, sounds, tastes, smells, or feels. And these words, example like look, sounds, taste, smell, or feels, these are all sense words, like to do with our senses, right? And if we look at a few examples, right? The sun looks bright, right? It looks bright. So bright being our adjective, right? Which tells us how the sun looks, right? So the sun looks bright. The drums sound loud, right? So sound can either be a soft sound or a loud sound. So in this case, it is loud. Loud being an adjective telling us about sound, right? Hearing. These cookies taste sweet. So it can either be sweet cookies, bitter cookies, right? But in this case, it tastes sweet. The air smells fresh, right? So fresh, it describes the smell or the scent, right? We can either say it doesn't smell fresh, meaning it can be a stinky smell or something. But in this case, it smells fresh. My hair feels soft, right? So how does it feel? Soft, meaning it is not hard, but it is soft, right? So these are also ways or words or the sense words in which we can describe a noun, right? In which we can describe a person, an animal, a place, or a thing, right? We can describe it based on looks, based on sounds, based on taste, based on smells, or based on feels. All right. The road is. We need to complete the sentence with the correct adjective. So if you were to describe a road, right, how would you, or what are the words that you would describe the road? The road is. So we can maybe describe the road as being bumpy. We can even describe the road as being smooth. We can describe the road as being sandy road, right? Or the road is wet, right? So there's many ways in which you can basically describe or tell us about the road, for example. So in this case, we can choose any adjective that best describes the road. And in this case, the road is either bumpy, smooth, sandy, or wet. Because they didn't specifically say we must choose one, but these are just a few, right? So if you were to describe the road, then of course, based on your location, you can basically describe your road. All right, so here they say the best answer is bumpy, right? And bumpy being an adjective that tells us how the road feels, right? So bumpy, it tells us how the road feels. All right, the water feels. So how does the water feel, right? So the water feels, we can either say the water feels warm, or we can say the water feels cold, right? So it depends if you're about to take a bath or if you're going to the pools, right? So it's either the water is warm or the water is cold, right? So the best possible adjective that we can maybe use, especially if it's maybe a pool, then we can say the water is cold. So cold being the adjective that describes how the water feels. The boy pulls a wagon, right? So we can maybe choose a best possible adjective to describe the wagon either in color, right? Which can either be the red wagon, can be the blue wagon, right? Can be a green wagon, or even the brown wagon, right? So over here, we are also describing this wagon specifically in color, right? So if we were to maybe choose a best possible answer, we can maybe choose the red wagon, right? Or basically any word that best describes the wagon, as long as it is an adjective that describes either a person, a place, an animal, or a thing. All right, let's do a little test, right? Complete the sentence with the adjective. Our dog's nose feels. So, does the dog's nose feel cold or does the dog's nose feel pit? How does the dog's nose feel? Cold or pit? All right. So pit is not an adjective, right? Which means that cold describe how the dog's nose feels. So if you have cold, then well done. Look at that horse's run legs or long legs, right? We need to choose the best adjective, or we need to choose the adjective that describes the horse's legs. All right, so if we were to describe the horse's legs, then we can say it is long, right? So we cannot describe the horse's legs run. Our nap dog sleeps all day or our fat dog sleeps all day. We need to complete the sentence with the correct adjective, right? All right, so if we were to choose the possible one, then we can say our fat dog because nap does not describe the dog. All right, so that is words, right? And we spoke about adjectives. This our lesson is on adjective, and we said an adjective it tells us about a person, a place, an animal, or a thing. Certain adjective tells us how many, and some adjectives tells us what kind. And then we also have sense words, right? And sense words either tells us about sound, taste, or maybe also how it feels. It's to do with our sense, right? Before we end of our lesson, we are going to the A plus classes.ca. Going to learning materials. Once we are by learning materials, we're going to reading. We're going to scroll right down up until we get to the four purple boxes, right? The first one is beginners phonics books, read fluency. We're going to click on the third one, which says read along audiobook one. And we're going to choose get wet. So we're going to choose the book Get Wet, right? All right. So this book on Get Wet, right? It is basically just also telling us many different ways in which we can get wet, right? All right. So that was just a book to also help us with our reading as well as our pronunciation. And just to recap on our lesson, it was on adjectives, right? And we said an adjective tells us about a person, a place, an animal, or a thing. Some adjectives tells us how many, and some adjectives tells us what kind. So that is the end of our lesson on adjectives. Thank you very much for joining the class or the session today. You should have an amazing evening further. Goodbye.